Good evening. Good evening. May I have...
I'm sorry, there's an interruption here.
What?
Stand aside, please.
Oh, my...
Could the committee come up here? Technical difficulties. At last week's forum, Gail announced that she's stepping down as the chairperson for the Islesboro Forum. And we, the committee that worked tirelessly for her, wanted to tangibly recognize Gail for her tireless work. So please accept from the entire committee this gift certificate, which is being displayed behind you. And just so you know, Gail, in her attempt to get me to take her place, paid for me to go to the Dark Harbor shop for breakfast, and I was stunned when this is what she ordered, a fit, responsible woman. Well, you're going back for another one. But Gail, the whole community appreciates what you did. Let's give her a round of applause.
Well, I can't wait for my breakfast. Oh. Well, I might be thrown off my balance here by that unexpected interruption. I was about to welcome you, and the first thing I should ask is for you to be sure that your phones are turned off, please, so they don't interrupt our program. This is the 6th program and the final one in our series for 2025. And I don't need to name all of the wonderful and very intelligent, insightful, innovative, resourceful, visionary committee members I have, because you've just seen them in the flesh. They've been a wonderful group to work with, and we already have some fantastic prospects for next year, so stay tuned for those. Meanwhile, I'll just say that we're a nonprofit, and we do have some modest expenses for a little bit of travel and for our wonderful technical producer, Jeff Glotzel, who's in the back. So if you feel inclined, we'd be very willing to accept a contribution in that wooden bowl that's over there as you go out. Or you can send a check to the address that's given on the website. And while I mentioned the website, I believe that all of our first 5 programs have been uploaded. We recorded them, so you're welcome to look for them there. And now let me get on with tonight's program, which has been brought to us by Sheila Baltzell. She's part of the multi-generational Elkins family, and I'll just say that she and her parents have been responsible for 30%, well, 33 1/3% of this year's programs. Her parents sponsored Dr. Mann last week, who was a wonderful contributor as well. So we're very grateful. There's a race between the Claflins and the Elkins Baltzells as to how many speakers they are going to bring to us. But stay tuned. I know you've got some fantastic things ahead with the vision of Bruce and his energy. He said over breakfast, Gail, I was planning just to become a bum and shed all of my responsibilities, but somehow the Heartstopper brought him around, so I recommend it as something that might convince someone you're trying to convince to take over some responsibility. So I'd like to get back to Sheila. Sheila and our speaker, Kate Zernike, were high school classmates, and they've known each other for those many years. And I think we have some other classmates from the same high school who are in the audience tonight, so a critical mass of those. And Sheila, in her own right, is a wonderfully talented media and graphics person. She's had a couple of careers, but you've seen her beautiful work in the Islesboro cookbook that we have. She did the layout for that beautifully, and contributes in so many ways to the island life. So I'm very proud to turn the microphone and podium over to Sheila to do a more detailed introduction of our speaker.
Oh, thank you so much, Gail, and thank you all for coming. I am so happy to welcome Kate Zernike back to Islesboro. The last time she was here was back in her high school days, many years ago. I'll leave it at that. Since then, Kate has built a remarkable career in journalism. She's worked as a front page reporter for the Boston Globe, and since 2000 for the New York Times, covering a wide range of subjects from education to science. She was part of the Pulitzer Prize winning reporting team on al-Qaeda after 9/11, and more recently you may have seen her stories on NIH funding cuts or the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. She's also the author of 2 books, Boiling Mad, about the Tea Party's rise during the Obama administration, and The Exceptions, which we'll hear more about tonight. Kate lives in Montclair, New Jersey with her husband and their 2 sons, and we're so grateful that she's made the trip back to Islesboro to speak at the forum tonight. Welcome and thank you, Kate.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me back and for those lovely introductions, Sheila. And also, whoever arranged the gift for Gail, I was a little worried when they told me there was a brief AV that it was going to be a picture of me and Sheila in high school, and so I'm glad that it was not that. And I do hope you enjoy the breakfast. I am going to talk tonight about how I came to tell this story in The Exceptions in 2 different ways, 20 years apart. And I consider this book both women's history and a history of science, but I will also say that in the 2 years since it was published, as I've traveled the country talking to people, it's clear from the audiences that this is still a story that continues to resonate today. So I'll talk a bit about that at the end. I first encountered the story that I tell in The Exceptions in March of 1999 when I was a reporter for the Boston Globe. And I'd begun covering higher education 6 months earlier in September of '98. And when I did, my father, who was a physicist, had suggested that I might want to do a story about the work that a physicist, a woman named Millie Dresselhaus at MIT, was doing to get more women into science. And I completely ignored him. I was like, I thought it sounded like the dullest story. I was like, I cannot imagine a single active verb in that story. And it wasn't that I knew from my dad how few women there were in physics, in the labs that he worked in and in the conferences that he attended. But I think I was inclined, and I'm a little embarrassed to say this now, I think I was inclined to think that the problem was only physics. And because, it was 1999, right? We were on the cusp of a new millennium. It was 3 decades after coeducation. For 2 decades at this point, women had made up more than half of all the undergraduates on American college campuses. And my understanding, and this is a really big part of it, my understanding of the struggles for women had really been shaped by the experience of my mother, who had graduated from college in 1954 and desperately wanted to go to law school. But she didn't go because her father, who was a banker in Toronto, consulted all of his lawyer friends, and they all said 2 to 1, well, I wouldn't hire a woman. And my mother, recognizing this to be true, thought she would go to business school instead. But she went to one of the very few programs specifically for women, which was the Harvard-Radcliffe program in business administration. Harvard Business School at the time did not allow women, so instead the professors, as she tells it, would walk across the bridge from Alston to Cambridge and essentially teach the same classes to the girls, as they were known. And because it was so rare to educate women in this way, for women for business, there was a front page story that year, in the Wall Street Journal in 1956 about this program. That was the year my mother started. And the story described the surprise of America's corporate leaders at how competent these women were. The only complaint they had was that the women married too soon. So as one official at a major Chicago bank said, they're too good looking and there are too many men at the bank. So my mother did get married. She quit her job and had 3 children. But she had been able to go to law school in the mid-'70s when her youngest child, was 7 and she was 45 years old. And from that experience, I thought, well, the doors are open. belatedly for her, but certainly for me. So I was 30 years old in 1999, and I had a career that I loved. I had a mentor who was incredibly supportive, and I thought there was no problem that hard work could not solve. So in March of 1999, an editor passed along a tip to me that there was something going on with women and discrimination at MIT. And largely because my father had planted this seed a few months earlier, I called the name of the woman that I'd been given, of the woman named Nancy Hopkins, who was a geneticist at MIT. And I suspected at the time that the story was going to be some sort of he said, she said about, well, there's discrimination, no, maybe it would be a lawsuit, and that there would be ultimately, it would end in kind of a stalemate, as I said, a he said, she said stalemate. But when I called Nancy, she said that in fact, the president of MIT was going to acknowledge that MIT had discriminated against the women on its faculty. And this really did strike me as a story. It's sort of what's known in journalism as a man bites dog story. It's not what you expect. The president was making this admission because the women on the science faculty had come together and produced a report that quantified all the ways in which women were disadvantaged compared to men at MIT. This included smaller salaries, fewer grants, less lab space. And what struck me also about the story was that the women had really leaned into their instincts as scientists to do this story. They'd started with a question and they gathered the data to prove their case. So I went to visit Nancy in her lab, and I asked her, as I typically do when I begin a story, how did this all start? And she said, well, she was one of the earliest researchers in this country to do research on zebrafish, and she had been doing this research, and she needed more space for her fish tanks in her lab, and she couldn't get more space even though she knew the men had more space than she did. And so I, being a reporter and a skeptic, I was like, well, how did you know you had less space than the men? And she said, well, I measured. And I was like, you measured? And she goes, with a tape measure? Like as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. So, and Nancy, at this point, she presented to me, I think she was wearing a suit at the time and a silk scarf and a brooch, and she had a slight English accent, which came from her English grandmother. She'd gone to Spence in New York City as a girl, where they taught the girls to curtsy every morning in case they should be presented someday before the Queen of England. But indeed, this very elegant woman in her mid-50s at the time had gotten down on her hands and knees and taken a tape measure and measured every inch of lab space, every inch of office space in that building, and discovered that, in fact, she did have less space even than men without tenure. Now, among reporters, there's a thing when we hear a detail that's really great, people go, oh, there's your lead. So the tape measure became the lead of my story. But what also grabbed my attention was the way that women described the discrimination. As they said in their report, it did not look like what they thought discrimination looked like. They, like me, had spent most of their careers thinking that discrimination had to be overt. You had to be denied a seat in a school or a job opportunity because you were a woman, and in fact, probably someone had to tell you that that was the reason you had been denied. But instead, what they described was what happened after women were let in the door, all the subtle ways they were made to feel unwelcome, as they described it, tolerated but not welcomed. This was women not getting credit for their discoveries or their ideas, not being included on grants or projects or on panels at scientific meetings, or in big decisions about a department, often because those decisions happened or those meetings were planned among a group of friends who all just happened to be men. But cumulatively, it made it really hard for women to advance to the same levels as men. And this problem got worse over the arc of women's careers. As young women, they were often well-treated, even celebrated, but as young men were groomed for leadership positions or named chairs or prizes, women were pretty much left to fend for themselves or even, in worse cases, pushed aside. The women referred to this as marginalization or 21st century discrimination. And they were very early in identifying what we now call unconscious bias, discrimination that happens unintentionally, and sometimes despite the very best of intentions, at institutions like MIT that consider themselves very progressive. But as fascinating as all this was to me, when I wrote this story, I thought, well, it's just interesting to me because I have this father who's a scientist and this mother who had this experience. But to my surprise and the surprise of everyone at MIT, this story really went viral around the world. It ran on the front page of the Boston Globe on March 21st, 1999, a Sunday. The next morning, the dean of the School of Science arrived at his office at MIT and discovered a camera crew from the CBS Evening News waiting outside his door. Nancy arrived in her office that morning, and Radio Australia was on the line, and pretty much her phone kept ringing for the next 2 weeks. The New York Times put the story on its front page the following Tuesday, and suddenly all the key players at MIT were flooded from emails from women around the country and around the world saying, "This is my story, and I thought I was the only one who felt this way." Nancy's tape measure became a symbol of all the unfairness that they had sensed but really had no way to quantify or explain before this. The president of MIT, Chuck Vest, became a leader in efforts to diversify university science faculties. The National Science Foundation modeled its programs for women on the MIT study. Nancy was invited to the White House for Equal Pay Day, and her tape measure went in the MIT Museum. Now, I like to say that I don't have favorite stories any more than I have a favorite child, but I really did admire the ingenuity of these women and how they made their case, and how I really thought that they'd made a real contribution to our understanding of gender discrimination, again, 3 decades after coeducation. Now, I began thinking about this as a book in January of 2018, and as I said, that's a full 20 years later. So you may be wondering, reasonably, what took you so long? Well, it was January, as I said, it was January of 2018, and I had been watching the cresting of the Me Too movement the previous fall. And I knew that story obviously was important to expose the egregious behavior that was happening in those cases. But I also thought that the more widespread problem for women was this less overt discrimination, this marginalization that the women at MIT had so ingeniously identified. What they talked about as 21st century discrimination was more pervasive and more stubborn than some of the Me Too cases because it was less obvious. Now, the things that might have been said about women openly years ago, doubting their intelligence, assuming that they were just going to go get married, so why bother giving them a job, those things hadn't gone away, they had just gone underground. But here was the challenge. When the women talked about unconscious bias in 1999, that was a new term. The first academic paper on unconscious bias was published in 1995. So this was a fresh idea in 1999. But of course, by the time I came back to write the book in 2018, the idea was not only no longer fresh, it was really something that people dismissed as no longer real, or they thought, well, I dealt with that in that goofy workplace training that I had to do, which was kind of annoying to me. But they really thought that the problems had gone away. So I saw this as a challenge, but also an opportunity to tell an intimate story about these women, and particularly about the arc of Nancy's career, to show how discrimination works in the 21st century and how these assumptions about women are ingrained in our culture, how bias operates so subtly that oftentimes the person who's being discriminated against doesn't even realize it. So in Nancy's case, it took her 20 years to understand it. And I spent a lot of time when I first started reporting the book asking, well, is science worse than other fields, and why would science be worse than other fields? And I came to quickly see that yes, indeed, I think there are reasons and ways in which science is worse. But Nancy's story almost uncannily overlapped with a critical period in women's history. So I came to understand that I was writing not just about women in science, but really about women. So Nancy's story in the book, and I love telling this story, I hope you'll enjoy it. Nancy's story in the book starts in 1963. It is the year that Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique has become a bestseller. It's the year of that President Kennedy's Commission on the Status of Women has also produced a national bestseller. States across the country are beginning to do their own commissions on the status of women. President Kennedy signs the Equal Pay Act based on this report that year. Nancy Hopkins is a 19-year-old junior at Radcliffe, again, the girls' wing of Harvard, and she's searching, as so many college students do, for meaning and purpose and what she's going to do with her life. Because it's 1963, she's expected to get married and have kids. Women, on average, at that time had 3 children, and the last of their children by the time they were 30. But Nancy also wants to do something really important with her life. The president of Radcliffe at this time was a woman named Polly Bunting. She was the first president of Radcliffe to have a PhD. And she had been talking everywhere from Cambridge to the front page, to the front cover of Time magazine about the culture of unexpectation for young women. And this was a culture that taught highly educated, intelligent women that their best and only use was in the home raising children. Polly Bunting wanted women to have children. She really wanted them to have families. She had 4 children of her own. But she also wanted them to have careers. And she encourages these women under her charge at Radcliffe to find their awfully interesting thing and engage their intellect there. On the practical matter of how you should have kids and also have a career, she's a little more vague, but Nancy has absorbed this message. And she figures she has 10 years to do her really big, important thing because she has to have children by 30. And she has 1 year now to figure out what that big important thing will be because there's a year until graduation. She has a steady boyfriend, and she knows that if she doesn't figure out what she's going to do in that next year, she will just slide too easily into marriage and the life in the suburbs and the dog and the 2 kids, 3 kids. But then she attends a 1-hour biology lecture taught by James Watson 4 months after he and Francis Crick have been awarded the Nobel Prize for decoding the structure of DNA. This has set off a revolution in modern genetics, and in 1 hour, Nancy falls in love with the potential of DNA. She sees it as the answer to all the questions that have consumed her since she was a girl. Why her mother got cancer, why people behave the way they do, why human beings would commit the atrocities that she's been hearing about on the radio since the end of World War II. Now, she's not a particularly bold young woman, but she summons the courage she does have to go to Watson after class and ask if she can work in his lab. And he readily agrees. And within a few months, he quickly anoints her a scientist and makes her his protege. In the next 10 years, Nancy goes on to do some of the earliest experiments in gene expression. By 1971, she has a husband and a PhD in biology, both from Harvard. And in all this time, she has not seen a single woman with children, or really a single woman, any one woman running a lab. So she thinks it's just not possible to run a lab or to be a scientist and also to have children. So she has job offers from Harvard Medical School and MIT, but facing down the age of 30, she decides she has to drop out of science and have kids. Then, very quickly and unexpectedly, her husband leaves her. He has been struggling to finish his book, the book he's been writing to try to earn tenure as an English professor at Harvard. He's watching her get job offers and feels competitive and like a failure compared to her. So after this divorce, Nancy, decides that she will not marry ever again. She will not have children. She will become what she later calls a nun of science. Now, she's the beneficiary of two historical developments at the time. One is that new discoveries have opened up the possibility of understanding viruses as the basic cause of cancer. So President Nixon has started funding the war on cancer. And the second is that the federal government is pressing universities to hire more women, saying it will take away funding if they don't. Very different from times now, right? So in 1973, newly single, Nancy Hopkins takes a job at the new cancer center at MIT, started by two of the most influential names in her field, who are Salvador Luria and David Baltimore, both Nobel Prize winners. And she knows that she is what we would later dismiss as an affirmative action baby, but she doesn't care because she thinks she is incredibly well qualified. In fact, she's been perfectly trained for this role. And she also believes that science is a meritocracy. So all she has to do is work really hard, do good experiments, and who knows, maybe she, like Jim Watson, can win a Nobel Prize by the time she's 24 years old. She thinks that the only thing that can stop women in science is having children. And as I like to say, the next 20 years is her schooling. She really discovers that there's no such thing as a pure meritocracy. Now, Nancy, like the other women I met at MIT, really didn't set out to be an activist. And in fact, they really all simply wanted to do their science. And Nancy in particular was not anything resembling a feminist at the time when she started. So for 20 years, she goes out of her way to explain what is happening to her as anything but gender discrimination. So in the beginning, in her early days at MIT, the problems are small, and they're not really things that anyone would complain about. She's the only woman on the faculty at the Cancer Center, so the UPS driver assumes she's the secretary, and she has to sign for the packages. And the postdocs assume that she's a technician or another postdoc, so they, don't treat her equally. They don't treat her like a faculty member, and they raid her incubator where she's created all these cells. These cells that she spent a long time cultivating. When she talks about her ideas in department meetings, she talks about her ideas for experiments. They go and do the experiments as their own. But if she looks to cast blame, she casts blame first on herself. Because she thinks, well, I'm just not willing to be ruthless enough. I'm too much the Upper East Side private school girl. I learned how to curtsy, but I didn't learn how to throw an elbow. Then she decides, so the lab at MIT is on the 5th floor of this new cancer center. And the 5th floor is renowned at MIT for being particularly competitive. The line around MIT is the lights never went out on the 5th floor. So Nancy thinks maybe the problem is just this intensely competitive 5th floor. So she just decides to move to the 3rd floor, even though that means she's going to have to run upstairs 2 floors to use all the equipment because there's no equipment on the 3rd floor. Then, after a bit of time there, she has a visit from a scientist from the NIH, a man she's never met before, and he comes to her to apologize because he knows that there's a man at Harvard Medical School who's been traveling the country giving talks that take credit for Nancy's big discovery, which was the discovery, in fact, that got her tenure. So she decides, it turns out it's not the 5th floor after all. Maybe the problem is cancer research, and it's just too competitive. So she changes fields, which is highly unusual for a scientist in his or her 30s and risky at that time. She moves into developmental biology, which has the advantage of being a field that at that time was really led by women. And she thinks of this as another experiment. What will science be like? Will it be different in a field that is led by women? And once again, she ends up being schooled. As her zebrafish work begins to go well, she finds that she can't get the same space. She does her measuring late at night. And the men at MIT who are in charge of space, she keeps saying, oh, don't be ridiculous, that's not true. They refuse to even look at the data that she's collected. And while she's trying to deal with the space problem, just as it looks like she might get it fixed, she discovers that she's also underpaid relative to men. And there's also a new challenge, which proves to be her breaking point. She has been asked to develop a new introductory biology class, and this is a new introductory biology course. This is very important to the biology department because it's the first time that biology is going to be required for all undergraduates at MIT. Previously, it had only been physics, chemistry, and calculus. But Nancy feels incredibly confident again because she has previously taught or developed and taught a course on biology for non-biology majors. This course has been so popular that Nancy actually had higher teacher ratings than any other person in the biology department. So she develops and then teaches this new course with a younger man who is an incredible phenom. He's a Rhodes Scholar, MacArthur Genius Award winner. He's just started pulling in millions of dollars to MIT for what will become the Human Genome Project. And they teach this new course together for 3 years. Everyone's thrilled with how it's going. At the end of this 3 years, unexpectedly, Nancy's department head calls her in and tells her that she's not going to teach the class anymore. This younger guy wants to teach it with another man in the department. And Nancy's completely baffled. She's, but our ratings are so good. And her department head's a little evasive on that. And so he says, go talk to these two guys who are going to teach the course together. And the two men are very honest with her. They tell her that they intend to start a company, and they're going to use this company to sell textbooks and teaching videos, CD-ROMs, to universities across the country based on this biology course that Nancy has helped develop. And they tell her, as they say, we intend to make millions. What they don't say, of course, is that they do not intend to include her on those millions. So first, again, Nancy defaults to thinking, maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe this is all my fault. But then she looks again at her teaching evaluations, and this is really what snaps her faith in the meritocracy, because she can see that her ratings are some of the highest in the department. The department head has in fact written across her last review, great job. So she spends many months trying to get this course back, to work everything out, and she finally resolves, it becomes Memorial Day, school's shutting down, it's clear that she's not going to get this course back. But she's so heartbroken and so disappointed that she writes a letter to the president of the university. She doesn't know this man, but she's heard that he cares about making it a more diverse campus. And so she writes and she tells him that she believes there's discrimination in the School of Science in salaries and in teaching assignments, and she believes that he will want to do something about this. But she gets cold feet at the end and worries that, again, she might be the problem, maybe she's not good enough, and that the president will assume this and just completely dismiss her. So she decides she's going to show this letter to one other woman in the biology department. She chooses a woman named Mary Lou Pardue, and she doesn't know Mary Lou very well. They work in different buildings, but she really respects her because Mary Lou was the first woman at MIT to be elected to the National Academy of Sciences. They go out to lunch in Kendall Square, and Nancy gives Mary Lou her letter to read, and she's reading it very slowly, and Nancy's watching her across the table and thinking, oh my God, of course, she's just gonna, she's stalling, and she's gonna tell me that this is, again, all my fault, I'm not good enough. And just as she's thinking that, Mary Lou looks up and says, I'd like to sign this letter, and I think we should go see the president because I've long thought that there was a problem for women in our department, particularly senior women. And Nancy, she describes this really as the moment that changed her life. She's thrilled to find one other person who feels the way she does. But then, in something of a stroke of genius, she says to Mary Lou, do you think there might be other women who feel this way? So as scientists, they decide to investigate, but they think surely it must be too hard to interview or survey all the women on the faculty at MIT. So they decide that they're going to go back to the School of Science and just start with the science department. So they go back, they they talk to a third biologist, and they have no idea who the women in the School of Science are. They pull down the course catalog from the shelf, and they go through and they begin writing down the names of the women. And that's when they discover, and again, this is 1994, that in the School of Science at MIT, there are 197 tenured men and 15 tenured women. Again, 1994, there's not a single woman of color in that list. So they pull in 2 more women who have cross appointments from the School of Engineering, and they head out to survey all these women. And they go office to office, and they just start out by saying, well, Nancy had this problem, and what's it like for you? And within about a week, All but one of these 17 women have signed a letter asking not the president, but the dean of the School of Science to establish a committee that would look into this question of whether there is discrimination against women. Now, I should put a pin in that 17th woman, because that woman, when this was all said and done, that woman who was a little uncertain that there was discrimination at MIT, she ended up being the most underpaid or least well-paid of all of these women. She was unwilling to sign the letter. They send this letter to the dean of the School of Science, they schedule a meeting with him, and they're very worried because they're sure that these women who sent this letter, they've surely created upset with the administration, and the administration has contacted the lawyers and they're going to be in trouble. But when they show up to the dean's office, in fact, he has no idea why they're there. He hasn't even read their letter. But then there's 6 of these women, and they sit around the table in his conference room, and they begin to tell him their stories. And the dean, who's a physicist named Bob Bergeneau, describes the next few moments as the kind of rare epiphany that accompanies his most important scientific discoveries. He had known each of these 6 women individually and really had a sense of what their stories were. And he said to me when I was doing the book, had any of these women come to me individually, I would have said, he would have explained it as, a one-off, right, as the exception. Oh, that's a circumstance. That woman didn't get that grant. That woman's got a personality conflict with this guy. It's an issue in the department. It's a personality conflict. It's the exception, not the rule. But as he's sitting around this table, hearing these women's stories, hearing them talk about their experiences at MIT, he sees the pattern and he realizes we have a problem. So they form this committee, which takes 4 years, because the men in the School of Science are initially very skeptical of this whole effort. They think they're scheming on the part of women, and this must be a problem. In true academic fashion, there has to be a committee to form the committee. They collect the data, and there's some reluctance to turn over data about salaries and space, but finally they get it. And ultimately, they produce the report that I end up talking to Nancy about, and this story, as I said, goes viral. Now, there had been other similar reports on other campuses over the years, at Johns Hopkins, at Harvard, elsewhere. Those had been sort of relegated to a shelf somewhere. This one really took off. And I think there were a couple of reasons that it did. One was that it was MIT, MIT did have standing. But as I said, Hopkins, Harvard also have standing, so you'd wonder why not there. I think it was also because these women could not be dismissed as affirmative action hires or complainers. They had all been doing science at the very highest levels for many years. Of those 16 women, 11 of them either were or have gone on to be members of the National Academy of Sciences. 4 either had been or went on to be awarded the National Medal of Science. It also resonated because the president of MIT recognized and acknowledged the problem. And his statement was very brief. It was only 2 paragraphs at the top of the report, but it was quoted in every account of this story because it was so powerful. And here's what he said. I have always believed that contemporary gender discrimination within universities is part reality and part perception. True, but I now understand that reality is by far the greater part of the balance. So after this report comes out, universities across the country, led by MIT, really made a concerted effort to get more women on their faculties and to keep them there. MIT, for instance, there had been no daycare. They created daycare. No woman had ever taken maternity leave. Suddenly, men had taken maternity leave to start companies, but women had never done it. The stigma went away. MIT put women in the administration for the first time. They were even on the highest governing body at MIT and oversaw every promotion and tenure case and the yearly salary equity reviews. Now, at this point, you may know that MIT is pretty essentially run by women. There's a female president, a female chancellor, a female provost. The School of Engineering, which has historically been very male, there are 8 departments. 4 of them are led by women. Last year it was 5, but one of those women went on to become the chancellor. But what you hear at other universities, and these reports are still being produced, is that women at senior faculty levels are still leaving because they don't feel valued on campuses or respected. When you talk to female PhD students, they will tell you, and they've produced reports showing this, the attrition rate among female PhD students is higher than it is for men. In 2018, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine produced a report about sexual harassment in the academy and found that 50% of all faculty members female faculty members had said that they experienced some form of it. But the biggest problem was not the egregious cases that we heard about in the Me Too movement, but this kind of marginalization that the women at MIT had talked about. So comments that were, either explicit or implied about women not being intelligent enough to do science. I think the issue that I've heard as I've talked about this for women, to women over the last 2 years since the book came out, it can really be summed up by one story in the book, which I think when I was writing the book, I didn't even appreciate the power of this story, but I think it has resonated. So it's in 1980, which is the year actually that the percentage of women on American college campuses began to overtake the percentage of men. And a colleague of Nancy's comes to her and asks if she wants to teach this genetics course with him. And she's like, great, I love genetics, I've taught it before, terrific, big important course, happy to do it. He says, great, let me go talk to the department head. So he goes and he comes back from the department head and he says, nope, can't happen. The department head has said, I know Nancy Hopkins is a great lecturer, but undergraduates will not accept scientific information from a woman at the front of a lecture hall. And again, so that's the response that I get from most of the audience is people gasp and they can't believe it and oh my God, why didn't she complain? In fact, Nancy recognized this to be true and thought that the department head had done her a great service because had she taught this course, she would have gotten bad teaching evaluations and it could have really ruined her career. But I think what this story shows is that if we are honest, we probably don't trust that information as much as we do from a man at the front of a lecture hall. And I think we should ask ourselves, do we trust information as much when it comes from a woman in a doctor's office or a woman in a corporate boardroom or on a news program or perhaps in the White House? Now, I said it was, so I think, one of the problems is that too often we sort of talk about successful women as if they are the exception. So at MIT, the issue was Millie Dresselhaus, this woman who my dad had mentioned. Millie was held up as the icon for all that could be done for women, all that women could do. And really, the men on the faculty were like, well, if there's a problem, that doesn't seem right because Millie's doing it. Millie was renowned she had 4 children. She'd taken a total of 5 days maternity leave because one child arrived when she was in her postdoc at Cornell. 2 arrived on weekends and 1 arrived on a snow day. She also had amazing childcare. She had a husband who was willing to put aside his career to help hers. So this was not the norm for women. Now, I said, I wanted to tell this story, and I thought I could tell it through Nancy's story, but as I said, it was hard to talk about unconscious bias in 2018 when I began. Now, at this point, as I'm still talking about it, it's become almost impossible to talk about it. In some cases, forbidden to talk about it. Certainly, we've seen that diversity programs are being canceled. The NIH has canceled any grants that allow for diversity. There's been executive orders from the Oval Office saying that no programs for diversity will be funded. I think there are many reasons that we find ourselves in this position on DEI, and I think there are people who are more qualified than I am to diagnose why that is definitively. But I think part of the problem is the way we talk about discrimination and diversity and inclusion, especially as we become so fractured and people become so identified with one small group or another. So people tend to talk about discrimination, the subject, as if there were sort of one piece of pie that everyone's aiming for. And if you give one group a little more pie, another group is inevitably going to lose out. We talk about, we're helping girls, no, now we have to help boys. We don't talk enough about what can we do in schools to make them more effective for everyone. And I think science is a great example of why diversity matters. Because as someone, Bob Brown, who was the chancellor of MIT at the time this report came out and later became president of BU, as he said to me, we rely on science to solve our most important challenges. Why would you want to even risk shutting out the ideas of half the population? Why would you not want to include a greater diversity of ideas? But I think, I think I'm a reporter, and so I'm a reporter and a writer, so I really believe in language. And I think also part of the problem is that we talk too much, that DEI has become such a devalued term. And I think maybe instead of talking about DEI, which is, as I said, now forbidden in many circles, we have to talk about becoming more curious about other people. One of the reasons that these women succeeded is that these women at MIT succeeded, is that they approached this inquiry with that spirit of curiosity rather than blame. They allowed that most of these men probably didn't set out to discriminate. Everyone was really acting in the roles that the culture had assigned to them, and they had to change that culture. And it really starts with that question that the women asked as they went from office to office talking to one another, what's it like for you? It was very moving to me to hear these women talk about how they did this, how they built their case. But in many ways, what was more moving to me in writing the book and in audiences since then, as the book has come out, was to hear how men had changed their minds. So the data was important, the tape measure that I fell in love with, but really what was important was the stories. Those were the stories really changed people's minds. And I think that's why this story was incredibly powerful. I find it an incredibly hopeful story. As I said, it offers not only an opportunity to talk about how discrimination works now, but also to define really a path forward for us. I love telling the story. I hope that you've enjoyed hearing a bit about it and that you might explore the book a bit further. And in that spirit of curiosity, I would love to take your questions. So thank you very much for having me. Yes.
I would just like to point out the irony that her pivotal moment was a lecture by James Watson,
Yes.
and now the contributions of Rosalind Franklin have been appreciated.
Yeah, so I talk about this in the book. Nancy actually, she was very close to Jim Watson and really credits him with starting her career. And there were women, I was talking to someone in the audience who was talking about how she actually changed fields because Jim Watson was her assigned advisor in her freshman year at Radcliffe, God help her. So she switched fields. But Jim Watson was supportive to particular women, to a lot of people. A lot of people really do give him credit. What's interesting, so Nancy talks about, she read The Double Helix, Jim Watson's book, his account of decoding the structure of DNA. She read The Double Helix in manuscript form on a ride from Cambridge to Cape Cod in his little, convertible MG. And she read the passages about Rosalind Franklin. She had never heard of Rosalind Franklin, right? So the interesting thing, I don't know if this is an irony or not, but is that Rosalind Franklin's her contribution really hadn't been recognized. And it was, in fact, the double helix where Jim Watson kind of copped the whole thing and said, I took that photograph. That was what informed everybody about Rosalind Franklin. But yes, I do think there's become much more attention on that in recent years. Of course, Jim Watson and Francis Crick won the Nobel Prize for their discovery. They were joined in that Nobel Prize by Maurice Wilkins, who had been a partner with Rosalind Franklin. Rosalind Franklin had died by this point. She had ovarian cancer. And there's a real question about whether, had she lived, what would have happened with the Nobel Prize? Because the Nobel Prize, well, first it can't be awarded posthumously, but it also can't be given to more than 3 people. So they would have had to make a decision. Are we just going to give it to Francis Crick and Jim Watson? Are we going to include Wilkins? Are we going to include Franklin? So I think that's why that story has continued to be powerful. But it always strikes me as interesting that Watson was the one who sort of told on himself. Yeah.
I kind of hesitate to ask this because it's such a huge question.
Yeah.
But I'm sitting here wondering, what is the problem? Is it underlying sex discrimination, gender discrimination in our culture, which of course we all know exists?
Mm-hmm.
But here we are in science where the facts are the basis of everything you do and every experiment you make.
Right.
What is it about our society or science in particular that continues to repress women the way it does and discriminate against them in so many ways?
Yeah. I mean, I should first say, of course, there has been remarkable progress since the MIT report, and we see more progress each year, although there's certainly some backsliding. I think one of the things that we assume about science is that, as Nancy did, that it was a pure meritocracy, that it was all about your numbers, all about your data. But of course, merit is something that's conferred, right? So merit is not an equation like gravity where you can work it out by X, Y, and Z. Somebody has to say, oh, that's the best experiment I've seen. Somebody has to say, oh, that's going to win the Nobel Prize. So again, if you have these assumptions about women, those are going to color those decisions about merit. So I think that's part of it. But as I said, when I told the story about Nancy teaching this class in genetics, I really do think that there is a fundamental issue of trusting women. So just to sort of segue a bit into my coverage for the Times, when I was writing about abortion, there's a pollster who I find her work really interesting, and she has the statistic that 49% of Americans will say that there are many irresponsible women who will decide to have an abortion in the last weeks of pregnancy. Now, the reality is of those numbers, there aren't a lot of abortions in those last weeks, but the idea that women cannot be trusted to make these decisions in a responsible way, I think that is what's underlying a lot of this, is just sort of, to be, I guess, generous or forgiving, I think you could also say that people need to be reminded of how many women have served successfully. And as I said, there is still there is still a tendency to sort of assume that the women who have succeeded are the exceptions, that we're not really sure we can trust the next one, and we got to be a little careful about her. So that would be my assumption. I'm sorry, I was supposed to repeat the questions. Is everyone hearing the questions pretty well? Okay, thank you. Yeah, anyone else? Yeah.
Can you comment on why more women aren't going into STEM in the first place?
I would actually say one of the most interesting things about the MIT report that these women produced was there was a graphic that looked at the percentage of women in each department in the School of Science by level. So undergraduate, graduate, postdoc, junior faculty. In two departments, chemistry and biology, the percentage of women way outweighed the percentage of men. So I don't think it is true that women are not going into STEM. I think what's happening is that as I said, the attrition rate tends to be higher. And it's for some of the reasons that I talked about. I think part of the problem is that we've done a really pretty great job at getting girls into STEM. There are a lot of programs for girls in STEM. I cannot tell you that, I'm touring colleges with my son. I cannot tell you the number of women who I've met I'm majoring in neuroscience and dance. They're definitely ambitious in terms of science. But I think what happens and what you see happen in the book is that in the 70s, the emphasis, this was led by Millie Dresselhaus, this woman I've talked about, the assumption was we just have to get more women into as undergraduates. And when we do that, they will naturally rise up through the pipeline and become women on the faculty. And what these women, the contribution of the women in the MIT report was to say that the pipeline leaks. And again, I think one of the reasons the pipeline leaks are, some of it is practical. For a long time, there was no daycare. It was a stigma to take maternity leave. So women were turning away themselves, but I think it is sort of this this feeling that there is still an assumption that maybe women shouldn't do science, maybe women are not capable of doing science at the same level.
Just a follow-on question to both of these.
Yeah.
So, can you describe the mechanics of the discrimination? Are these closed-door, smoke-filled rooms where the guys sit around and decide on tenure, and we're going to reject women, and we're going to give it to? And then, how does this all work?
Well, it's a little like that, but it's also sort of, I think it is, again, it's the subtle, it's, as I said, it's the planning of the conferences, and it's all done between men. So, Bob says, oh, we should get John on that panel, and John says, oh, I have my friend Greg, and Greg says, I've got, Sam. And so soon you have when I wrote the story in 1999, I had never heard this phrase, but now the term is a manel, right? You end up with all men on the panel. So I think that's part of it. I think it's sort of self-perpetuating for that reason. I'm trying to think of other mechanics that I can talk about. Yeah, I think it's. Yes, Bill.
Could you just speak to the larger than it used to be, number of women who are presidents at universities?
Yes. So.
Was that part of this
Yeah.
movement?
Yes. So this report, as I said, came out in March of 1999. Sorry, the question was about female presidents at colleges. So this report came out in 1999. In 2000, you would know because you're an alum, but in 2001, I think, was when Princeton named Shirley Tillman as president of Princeton. So Shirley Tillman, then the following year, MIT named its first woman. Drew Faust, of course, took over, I think, in the mid-2000s at Harvard. So we really have seen an increase. And it's interesting how this MIT report kind of really populated that. So Shirley Tillman at Princeton was a molecular biologist herself. She was actually also a single mother. She was raising 2 kids on her own. So she and Nancy had worked together. She had also worked with Jim Watson on the Human Genome Project. So Shirley became president, and then one of the first things she did at Princeton was to say, we want to do the same kind of report that MIT did. So she consulted a woman named Ginger Zakian on the faculty there. They did a report, but they said, we really need to call on an economist to look at these numbers. And they called in Christina Paxson. And Christina Paxson, of course, went on to become president of Brown. Maud Mandel served under Christina Paxson at Brown. Maud Mandel is now president at Williams. So you really have seen kind of a flowering. That said, given that, again, female undergraduates, it's nearly 60% of undergraduates on American campuses are women. You would probably think that the percentage of female presidents would be higher. It's about 30%, which is still, disproportionately low. And of course, I would say, when we saw the beginnings of all the attacks on campuses, even before October 7th, when people were beginning to file complaints about anti-Semitism on American college campuses, the they were filing Title VI complaints. A very high percentage of those complaints, 80% of the initial complaints over a 2-year period, were against institutions led by women. So it really was the institutions led by women that came under fire. And of course, there was that famous congressional hearing where you had these 3 female presidents. And I will fully acknowledge that they did not, they made a few mistakes, but were those mistakes so fatal that they needed to lose their jobs? That's, I think, a different question. Yes.
I had a question about young women going into either medicine or science. And given your experience talking with so many people, what would your advice be to young women? Do they find a mentor who is a woman and avoid male mentors? Like, what would...
No, in fact, I think one of the things that these women did so well, or did so intelligently, was, so Nancy was really angry by the time she gets to this point, and they're asking for the committee, but so at first she's like, I want a woman in every department making sure that everything's fair, like calling the shots. And I'm like, that's not gonna work. But so some of the women on the committee, some of the women in the group were like, we need a committee made up only of women. And the young women on that committee said, no, that's a mistake. What we need is a committee, and the Dean of Science recognized this, we need men on that committee, and we need powerful men, because if men are not behind this report, nobody will take it seriously. So that committee included a Nobel Prize winner, department heads. So I think, in fact, for young women, you find yourself not only a mentor, but a sponsor. And it actually doesn't matter whether it's a man or a woman. You just need someone in that role to help you. I also think you have to, you have to have the courage of your convictions. And that's what I hear from my friends who are scientists, is that you really, you are going to, a friend of mine who is quite accomplished, she talks about being at Brown, and gradually over the years, freshman year, she and her roommate were in these classes and they saw women, and the next year there were fewer women, and then a year after that, fewer women. And so you really have to get it out. There are going to be challenges that are unique to you. So, yeah.
So how does this all play against the aggrieved bro culture? That,
Oh, well.
no, because the complaint is that there's no place for the poor white man in our culture. And it's very hard to understand that anger and so much that's risen from it, in contrast with the struggles of, to reach equality. It doesn't really matter whether you're talking about women or people of color prior.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. Now the only people we're concerned about is poor white men.
Yeah, and I do think there's been a lot of backsliding, particularly in the last 6 months. 6 months, 8 months, what is it now? Yeah, forever. But this idea that now you can say these things openly. In fact, you will be celebrated for saying those things openly. I think, again, as I say, perhaps I'm naive or too hopeful, but I really do think we have to stop talking about DEI. We have to start saying, for a while I was like, we have to talk about empathy. Well, of course, Elon Musk thinks empathy is a bad word. So let's talk about curiosity. what is it like for you? Let's genuinely understand what people's experience is. And I think, there certainly is resentment among white men. I know a lot of women who are saying, I will never vote for a woman for president again because I'm just not going to waste my vote. So I do think there's a real reckoning. I'm sorry to say that this story remains very relevant. Yes.
So it's my impression, but I don't know, if this plays out to a lesser extent in the UK and Europe, and I'm wondering if that is the case, what is it that we can learn from them in terms of how they've dealt with this problem in
Europe, you say? It's funny. In the 70s, when they were talking about getting more female undergraduates, there were reports that were talking about how European women did not have the same struggle. And there was this great line that it was like, somehow they blamed it on Pat Nixon. Like Pat Nixon was at home and cooking, I don't know. So American girls thought that's which I think is probably wrong. I found that it's pretty mixed. So I have talked to really incredibly accomplished mathematicians from Germany who say they did not see this at all in Germany. I've talked to a physical geologist from Italy who said she just never had any sense until she came to this country that there was discrimination. I don't know, honestly, what we can learn because I think it's a little bit uneven. I think in England the situation is different. And certainly Nancy Hopkins, who's still alive, she gets calls from people all the time who are doing these kind of reports, not only in this country, but in Europe as well, who are finding the same issues. So I'm not sure that it's not sure that we really have that I could say Europe has cracked the code on this. So, what's that, China? I don't know, because it's so sealed off. Yes.
So much of what you're talking about are actually structural features
Yeah.
of higher education and the U.S. Culture and Western culture. And so for me, part of what needs to happen is that our structures change. And you were talking about childcare, but our men who lead field programs need to be taught about how to treat women. And so it is very true. We need men to raise their voices and make it part of everybody's responsibility to be sure that there is equitable treatment regardless of the privileges somebody arrives with.
So I would say two things to that. One is that Nancy Hopkins can she can get really discouraged about, she can get excited about progress and discouraged about it. One of the things that gives her hope is the way men have reacted. We spoke at New England Biolabs last year, and the chief scientific officer there is a Nobel Prize winner, Rich Roberts, and he got up and he said, "This book changed my life. I realized that I had been doing this to women all my career." He said, "I have totally changed." He said, "I will no longer speak at a conference unless there's a certain number of women." He was trying to get an effort among other Nobel Prize winners to agree to the same pledge. It was pretty interesting. But Nancy really liked something that she heard from Elizabeth Spelke, who was a psychologist at Harvard now, but she was one of the women who was hired at MIT after this report and sort of is trying to correct it. And Liz studies unconscious bias or bias, and Nancy said, is there anything we can you change people's bias? And Liz's answer is no, but you can change the culture. So now I'm going to tell a story about my son. As again, a hopeful story, maybe. When I was writing this book, it was beginning of COVID. My son had just turned 13 the day that New York City shut down for COVID. So like many other American families, we're looking for movies that we can all watch together as a family. And I'm like, I'm writing this book about MIT. Let's watch Good Will Hunting. Kids have never seen it. So we watch Good Will Hunting, and has everyone seen it pretty much? Yeah. So we come to the scene where, the genius janitor is cleaning as he's swabbing the floors, and there's the equation on the board that nobody can solve. And lo and behold, Good Will Hunting solves the equation. And my son, the 13-year-old, is watching this, and he goes, "Wow, he's Nancy smart." So, I really think, now he's like a big, burly football player, but, I really think that we can change the expectations of men. One of the woman who was head of the faculty when MIT produced this report and was really largely responsible for it, she talks about how, it's a world created by men for men, and so you really have to think about how to change the systems. I would argue it's pretty hard to start from scratch. You have to work with what you have. So, I guess I tell that story about my son because in the hopes that the more we talk about how exceptional women are not exceptional, they're actually all over. You can see women doing amazing things. You can trust women to do amazing things. I think that's how we change the culture. Thank you for your question. Yeah.
Are there any analogous studies in other fields, in the humanities, for example?
Yeah, the question is, are there studies in other fields? And as I said, certainly other campuses had done these studies before and have done them since. I spoke at Brown a couple of years ago, and they had done a study, partly because they had done a study on the status of women, and that looked at departments across the board. So I would say and again, the problem is that women are generally well treated as junior faculty members, but by the time they're senior faculty members, they don't feel as valued or listened to in the department, which again, I think is a cultural issue. I do think that this is true in other subjects. I think science, partly because it is, as Nancy Hopkins would say, you can't schedule discovery, right? So the childcare issue does become a little harder there because you can't say I'm going to do this by 5 o'clock and pick up the kid at 6. So I think there are some structural problems, not that they can't be solved in science, but we haven't been as good at solving them. And it's funny, I did an event at a bookstore in Greenwich a couple of summers ago, and this woman very earnestly said, are you going to write a book about other fields? Are you going to do law and then finance? And I was like, I'd be going forever. But yes, that this is what I've heard. And I've heard it from what's been, a little heartbreaking is that I've heard it from women Nancy's age, women my age, and also a lot of younger women who see a lot of themselves in this book. So, yes.
Yes, I see your byline in the New York Times, and your stories cover a range of subjects. You're not just focused on this one silo. So I'm curious to know what other topics you're working on that inspire the same, passion and desire to dig deeply as this one did.
I think this book really made kind of partly it just gave me a number of sources in science, but it's really sort of awakened in me a fascination with science. Nancy and I did an event at the National Academy of Sciences last spring. And my younger son said to me, well, if you're so into science, why didn't you become a scientist? And I was like, I didn't kind of know it existed. So lately I've been focusing a lot on the cuts to the NIH, as Sheila said when she introduced me. But I really think, I think this is an incredibly important story because we have, when you look, for instance, at James Watson, Robert Oppenheimer, they went to Europe to study. And that's what scientists did for a time. They went to Europe because that was where the great universities were. After World War II, there was a really conscious effort in this country to make American universities great and to have this sort of three-legged stool between the federal government, universities, and industry, all to the betterment of American citizens. And we've seen so many, Google comes out of that, and, drugs for cystic fibrosis and cancer come out of NIH research. So that's sort of what I've been thinking about lately, partly because I just was getting all of these panicked phone calls from scientists in the weeks after Inauguration Day. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I've had a number of friends who've had to pull grants recently because of language in their applications referring to gender or anything. And I was just wondering, sort of, as you've been touring and talking, obviously there's certain terminology we can't use anymore. Have you come across any particularly good angles that people have come up with for solutions to still be able to investigate?
No, I think this is a real problem. So the advanced program, which I mentioned, the National Science Foundation that was created in response to the MIT report, that's gone. It's eliminated because it has diversity in the title. But really I did a story about this a couple weeks ago. What's interesting to me is not, the NIH actually has a pretty broad definition of diversity. And they've looked at labs and who works in scientific labs. And it's not only is there a problem with women, and particularly women of color, people of color, but the people who were professors at universities there's this astonishing number, 25 times more likely to have a parent with a PhD. So what the NIH has done, and the National Science Foundation a little bit, maybe to a lesser degree, is try to define diversity as, people whose parents didn't go to college, people from rural areas where there aren't science or medical professionals, people who've, had Pell Grants because they were, or were on free and reduced lunch. What's I think unfortunate and an unintended consequence by the administration is that those programs too have been cut. Because if you think about it, the administration is criticizing universities for being too elite. Well, these programs were trying to make universities less elite. They were trying to diversify student faculties in other ways, not just gender and race. Have I heard workarounds? Not really. I did a story a couple of months ago on the pause on mRNA research technology, and that was sort of goofy. They were trying to come up with different terms that would sort of coyly describe what messenger RNA does without saying messenger RNA. So I don't think anybody's figured out a good solution so far, except I think a lot of people are putting hopes in the courts and hoping that the courts will overturn this, which is going to be a long process. Yes, one more. Anybody? Oh, we're done. Oh, one more.
This is just an illustration of that unwitting bias that you have, that exists between men and women. And this is a true story that was told and written up in Science or Nature by the protagonist, who was a woman who became transgendered and became a man.
Ben Barris.
Yes. Well, you know the story.
Yeah, but tell it, because it's a good story.
So Barbara, when she became Ben, went to a meeting and overheard at a neuroscience meeting someone talking about her behind her back. And she was by then Ben, and the person said, oh, Ben Barris, he's a fabulous scientist. He's much better than his sister Barbara.
So there's actually so Nancy Hopkins was very close to Ben Barris, and Ben described the MIT report as a really pivotal moment for him, and she wrote the foreword to his book. Ben Barris unfortunately died too young. There's a documentary filmmaker making a film about Ben Barris, so maybe you can look for that. It's a great story. Thank you all. It's been such a pleasure.
Kate, that was splendid, and I hope that you pursue the area of research that you mentioned interested you, which is the damage to our medical and scientific research infrastructure and people that is occurring with the cuts in science funding that the institutions and people are now experiencing. So please, go for that. It's very difficult to get your hands around it, to measure it with a tape measure and figure out just what the impacts are. So I have a couple of things to say. One is I'd like to ask my committee members to come back here. I'd like to have a photograph with all of you and my flowers, so if you could, not right at this instant, but when we finish. And then I just have to say how much I have enjoyed and loved being associated with the Forum. It's a wonderful institution, started by the fathers of some of the people in the room, and it has a tremendous history and tradition, and I feel very reassured and confident that it's going to continue in the years ahead because of the current committee that we have and the prospects for leadership succession. So thank you for being part of the audience, and have a good rest of your summer. Night.